Please listen carefully.
Hello, and welcome to GasGasGas. This is the best podcast for the FRCA primary exam. Our goal is to fill your brain with all this highly useful information. You might be in the gym right now, commuting, or ironing your scrubs. Regardless, the revision is eventually going to end. But for now, expect facts, concepts, model answers, and the odd tangent. Make sure to check out GasGasGas.uk. There's show notes there's loads more detail. Make sure to like and subscribe. Anyway, buckle up, get ready for your mind to be bent into a new shape, and let's get on with the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Gas Gas Gas. You're perhaps scratching your heads and wondering, have I travelled forward in time? I don't remember there being an episode last week, and you're right. After the slight debacle with that opioid quiz episode where the sound went all wrong, and that's because I was rushing, I've decided I'm going to go 2 weekly, purely so that I can actually focus on delivering something that's excellent and up to my perpetually escalating standards. I hope you are sat there and you're listening carefully. Today we are doing isoflurane, and then we're going to dabble with Dalton's law at the end. We're going to handle everything you need to know about iso, plus a few extra bits and pieces, just because it's a drug we probably actually don't reach for that often, because we always reach for the yellow sevoflurane coloured stuff, don't we? If you missed out the introduction to Volatiles episode, I'd say probably wind back and listen to that first, so that when I vomit some numbers at you, you'll know what I'm on about, and get yourself ready for the sevoflurane episode in 2 weeks' time. And then it's going to be halothane. So classify or die here, folks. What class of drugs is isoflurane associated with? I'm sure you know. I'm sure it's right on the tip of your tongue. It is a halogenated methyl ethyl ether. I'll say that again. A halogenated methyl ethyl ether. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It's been available for use in the UK since 1983. Originally, its structurally similar friend, and when I say structurally similar, I mean it's a structural isomer, so it's the same molecules in a different arrangement. Its pal enflurane was easier to manufacture, and that's why enflurane kind of came before isoflurane. They were having some challenges with isoflurane. What chemicals make up isoflurane? Well, there's 3 carbons, 2 hydrogens, a chloride, 5 fluorines, and an oxygen molecule. I'd definitely say you need to get on the show notes, folks. I've got some images of the chemical structures of isoflurane, and in exams gone by, they've definitely asked, here, draw iso, sevo, and tell us the differences. Now, they might not do that nowadays. They might ask you about propofol, because we probably use a lot more propofol, but you probably at least need to have an idea of this, just in case. One of the important distinguishing factors for isoflurane compared to enflurane is that there are 3 fluorine molecules on the terminal ethyl carbon. This means that your liver, even though it so desperately desires to break down these molecules, because it loves a fight, those fluorine molecules are exceptionally obstructive, and very little metabolism of isoflurane occurs. How is it presented? So isoflurane is a clear, colourless liquid. It is protected from light because it doesn't tolerate light, it breaks down. And according to Wade and Stevens, referenced in the show notes, it has a pungent ethereal odour. Now, interestingly, we all reach for sevoflurane for induction of anaesthesia in the gas induction variety, but you can also do it with isoflurane. The trick with isoflurane, seemingly, is that you can't just smash it to 8 and hold that mask on that person, because then it is irritant. But if you sneak it in, slowly but surely, in the gently, gently, softly, softly style, then you can use isoflurane as a gas induction agent, which worked better than enflurane and worked better than diethyl ether that was also available floating around in the cupboards once upon a time. Its molecular weight is 184.5 grams per mole, and its colour coding is purple. And these are important if you get asked in an exam about how to avoid putting the wrong vapour agent in the wrong vaporizer. There's colour coding. The bottle to vaporizer interface is keyed, so you cannot inadvertently attach one to the other. Once upon a time you used to be able to just pour it in. You can't anymore. And this is important because each vaporizer has a slightly different set of thermal compensation and expectation of the saturated vapor pressure inside the vaporizer with which to then deliver a percent fraction into your gas flow. So if you mix it up, you can cause mischief. So with all the volatiles, at least the ones that we use commonly, and I would argue that that is going to be isoflurane, sevoflurane, and they'll probably will have the potential to ask you about desflurane, you should know sets of numbers. And obviously this really helps you treat patients with compassion and care But eventually it will mean that you have in your head a frame of reference as to which one behaves more like this and which one behaves less like this. So isoflurane boils at 48.5 degrees. Now, unless we are unfortunate and doing anaesthesia in the Sahara Desert, in our cold and gloomy United Kingdom climate, that means that the saturated vapour pressure for isoflurane remains predictable at standard hospital temperatures. The saturated vapour pressure at 20 degrees of isoflurane is 32 kilopascals, unless, of course, you're reading Peck and Hill, who seem to have a different opinion and say it is 33.2 kilopascals. Great. Remember, folks, saturated vapour pressure is the partial pressure that isoflurane will exert once it has reached equilibrium between the liquid and the vapour states at 20 degrees. The MAC of isoflurane, 1.17. So generally, aim for an end tidal of 1.2 and you'll have a MAC of 1 when you're using isoflurane. Blood gas solubility is 1.4. Remember, Sevo is 0.69 and desflurane, if I'm remembering correctly, 1 second, is 0.45. So less soluble in blood again. Remember, blood gas solubility is the thing that dictates onset and offset, because the isoflurane's just like, I don't want to be in the blood. I either want to be in the alveolus escaping or out in the fatty tissues in the brain where it feels nice. The more soluble it is in the blood, the more it's a bit dozy and a bit like, we're going to get there eventually. Yeah, oh, I've just gone past the brain again. Oh, well, I'm sure next time I get pumped past the brain, then I'll go in the brain. So lower solubility, faster onset and offset. Then you have oil gas solubility. Again, wish they had picked slightly clearer terminology. Of 98 in isoflurane, and this relates to potency. And in this world, a higher oil gas solubility coefficient yields a more potent volatile agent. So the oil gas solubility of desflurane is a mere 25. You can sit there and figure out that you would therefore expect the amount of desflurane required to achieve a MAC of 1 is more. And you're right, 1 MAC of des is an end tidal of 6.6 of desflurane. Like, I don't know, 1, 2, like several times more, like 4.5, 5 times more than ISO. So you end up using a lot more of it. And we're all thinking, haha, we're very clever because it offsets much quicker than sevoflurane, you know. But you have to use a hell of a lot more des than sevo and a hell of a lot more des than ISO to achieve that apparent convenient offset time and titratability. I don't think we do as much volatile titrating as perhaps once upon a time happened. I think we're luckier to have opioids that work quite quickly and offset quite quickly if we've got highly stimulating episodes in our anaesthetics that mean that we kind of just say we want a MAC of 0.8 to 1 and we're going to stay there. And if it's a particularly stimulating part of the operation, we're not going to go to a MAC of 1.5 or 2. We're just going to give them pain relief until we have that nice smooth tramline anaesthetic chart where it's not jumping up and down all over the place. Or at least that's what we desire. If we achieve that smooth tramline anaesthetic chart, that's another question. So, how do volatile anaesthetic agents work? The key phrases to get across in the exam and to get into your brain is that it influences and potentiates GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid receptors. There are 2 types of receptors, GABA A and GABA B. GABA A are pores, which allow ions to shift through them, classically chloride. GABA B is a metabotropic. That means it has an intracellular secondary messenger system type effect. The only drug that we kind of use often that works on GABA B is baclofen, but we're interested in GABA A. Seeing it as a pore or a channel that lets an ion through, we call it ionotropic. When you open that channel, you let chloride ions in, generally speaking. Those chloride ions get in and make the cell more electronegative. That means that it's harder for that cell to depolarize. That means communication between these cells, or neurons as we probably should be calling them, is inhibited. That's the protein theory for volatile anesthetic action. Now, before we kind of had an idea of what a GABA A receptor was, because we didn't have electron microscopes and, times were gone by, as you would expect, academics, anaesthetists, chemists were curious about how volatile anesthetic agents seem to just render people, motionless, still, and would enable a surgeon to go rummaging around inside. They came up with the concept that as they were generally then lipid-soluble molecules, Mayer and Overton suggested that these molecules get in amongst the lipid bilayers of cells and, the effect cell that we're interested in, neuron, and impair transmission by sort of bulking up, thickening up, and altering the nature of these lipid bilayers that exist around every neuron. It had some weight because you could see the more lipid soluble you were, the less agent you needed. So the presumption was if it was more lipid soluble, it was getting to that effect site, cell membrane, and causing mischief. It started falling down when there were not terribly lipid soluble agents that also seemed to induce anesthesia, and fell down further once we'd made progress on understanding all these proteins and receptors that alter how cells behave. Now, the real true question is, how does altering and creating electronegative neurons really disable your consciousness? And that's a great question, and one that is yet to be answered. So, thinking more about the pharmacodynamics of isoflurane, part of that obviously is how does the drug work? But the other part of it is what side effects does that drug have on the human body? Whenever you're in this situation and you're being asked about this, just break it down into organ system. Nice and organized, really easy. If it's quite a weird drug or a weird thing and you can't quite break it down from organ system, then you could do early, delayed, and late side effects. That kind of works better for complications of an intervention. But just you could think early, delayed, late. With steroids, you get early effects and then, you get horrible ulcers and your bones start turning to dust. That's a late effect. So, isoflurane, cardiovascular side effects. What does it do to your vascular resistance? So isoflurane, as most other volatiles are, is vasodilatory. It probably does this by causing mischief with calcium channels, but that's excessive information for you to know. What does it do from a chronotropy perspective? At high doses of isoflurane, you'll start slowing down. From an inotropy perspective, at high doses, it has a negative effect. It doesn't seem to alter the conducting system particularly, i.e. dromotropy. I have no idea if it does anything to make the heart more readily able to relax in diastole. And from a bathmotropy perspective, i.e. excitability, it's super stable, unlike halothane, which is a bit of a pest. But we'll get there on the halothane. Now, what about coronary arteries? So, in animal models, it seems to suggest that isoflurane vasodilates coronary arteries. Now, you might be thinking, oh, that's great, yeah, more blood flow to the myocardium, woo. But remember that if you've got a stiff, calcified atheromatous artery that, you could probably smash with a hammer, it cannot vasodilate. So if you've got blood flow that runs up to a fork and one of them is atheromatous and one of them is nice and normal, and you dilate that nice and normal vessel, blood flow will preferentially hose down the nice, big, well-dilated vessel, and that's all well and good, but it means that then your chewy, gammy vessel doesn't really get very much blood flow. That's a problem. You would call this coronary steel. Now, I've told you all that because it does seem to appear in textbooks and things, but in humans, it doesn't seem to play out. There's also suggestions that isoflurane can be great for ischemic conditioning of the myocardium, which was something you might think about in cardiac surgery. And again, unfortunately for Homo anaestheticus, that doesn't bear fruit either. So probably wouldn't stress about if it makes your heart happy or sad in any way different to sevoflurane may make your heart happy or sad. If you wanted to try and draw all these cardiac effects together, you could say it has a dose-related reduction in cardiac output. Isoflurane respiratory side effects. So give someone ISO, they'll start breathing a bit more actually, but their depth of breathing goes down. From a parenchymal perspective, because remember, rate and depth are kind of mediated by your medulla oblongata, ventral and dorsal respiratory groups, etc. So that's almost really like a respiratory effect, but via the brain. The parenchymal effects, i.e. the effects of isoflurane physically on your lung, bronchodilating, always handy. It inhibits hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. That might reduce your pulmonary vascular resistance and make your right heart a little bit happier. But it also might mean that you start perfusing areas of lungs that are diseased and knackered, and actually it's quite hard to get the oxygen there, so you might actually see a shunt. And then it is on the spectrum of being an airway irritant, isoflurane. We said earlier that you can do a gas induction with ISO if you're careful. That skill is well and truly gone because we've got sevoflurane. Why would you not just use sevoflurane for a gas induction if it's literally sat right there next to you? But you could if you're under a bush with fighter jets zooming over your head and all you had was isoflurane. Well, you could do a gas induction. CNS effects. So again, we're thinking now like CNS parenchyma. Much like with most volatile anaesthetic agents, isoflurane can increase your intracranial pressure. It does this by cerebral vasodilation. Does isoflurane alter your seizure threshold? No, doesn't mess with that. It is non-epileptogenic. But as with most volatile anaesthetic agents, you will have an increased odds of nausea and vomiting. MSK-wise, metabolic MSK-wise, with prolonged administration of isoflurane, say you're doing an 8-hour cardiac case or whatever, or a laparotomy, and it's just taking forever, it can cause hyperglycemia, and that slowly creeps up. And then from a musculoskeletal perspective, it will cause a decrease in tone in a dose-dependent manner. So I'm sure you found yourselves in situations with volatiles, this happens with all volatiles, whereby the train of 4 is not exactly inspiring at the end of the cakes, and you're thinking, oh damn, have I been a bit too heavy-handed with the rocuronium or the atracurium? Am I going to get some eyebrows raised because the patient's still paralysed and we need to send for the next? But you can turn off the gas and you will expect to see an improvement in your train of 4 to the point where you might decide that you are in a reversible state. The important thing here, though, is if you end up with a patient who is now technically awake from a brain perspective, but they're still paralysed because you were heavy-handed with the atracurium, now you've got an aware paralysed patient or a partially paralysed patient, and they're all jerky and they feel like they can't breathe. Unpleasant for them, significantly unpleasant, and puts them at risk of post-op pulmonary complications. So if you've got 2 twitches, then you've just fluffed it and you're going to have to wait unless you have a reversible agent like ROC or vecuronium, where you could use Sigamidex. In times gone by, they would just give huge doses of glycopyrrolate and neostigmine and cross their fingers, but you run the risk of recurarization if actually you've been really heavy-handed with relaxant. But that was a bit of a tangent, but that's an important thing to differentiate in your mind. And what is the endpoint or the toxic signs of isoflurane? Every drug is a poison in a big enough dose, and technically isoflurane's a poison in the wrong hands in quite small doses. The endpoint is CVS collapse, i.e. their blood pressure is crap, their cardiac output is crap, their heart rate is low. This is a situation you don't want to find yourself in, because if you've got terrible cardiac output, then your ability to clear isoflurane from the tissues and excrete it to reduce your concentration and therefore reduce your toxic effects is quite significantly impaired. The positive is that the window and the gap between too much isoflurane and an anaesthetic safe dose of isoflurane is quite big, so you'd have to really try quite hard to overdose the patient. But again, if you are abroad under a bush with marauding, rifle-carrying individuals, and you haven't got end-tidal isoflurane monitoring, well, the argument is probably don't use isoflurane. Ketamine's a good choice. Then you might find yourself in a situation where you don't know how much you've dosed the patient with and where you are. And that's why modern anaesthesia is super-duper safe, and historic anaesthesia, where we didn't have clever gas analyzers and all these sorts of things, was less safe. Okay, so what about the pharmacokinetics of isoflurane? Now, this is pretty sparse, I'm afraid, guys. If you get asked what the pharmacokinetics of isoflurane in the exam, remember this is what the body does to the drug. As you expect, it's quite lipid soluble, so it distributes eventually quite evenly. It will preferentially distribute to areas of high cardiac output before equilibrating throughout the patient as you journey through your anaesthetic. Absorption, well, we know it's readily absorbed through the alveoli. It's kind of a given, but maybe you should open with it is readily absorbed through the alveoli. Metabolism, this is something that's important with volatiles, and isoflurane is 0.2% metabolized via oxidation and dehalogenation reactions. Therefore, you can say that it is 99.8% eliminated unchanged via the lungs. And boom, that is everything you really need to know about isoflurane, and a few little extra bits here and there. So well done, guys, for getting this far. I'll just take the cheeky opportunity to say, if you're enjoying the show, then feel free to fire off a donation. The link's in the show notes. Helps keep the show running. Or check out the link to Buy Me a Coffee that Dr. J. Toe suggested I should do, because it's perhaps a bit simpler. Maybe I was being awkward by using PayPal. So yeah, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link now as well, folks. So you've had some drug teaching. What about some useful physics-y type teaching? So we need to think about Dalton's law of partial pressure. This is one of a multitude of laws that you need to get a grip of to understand how gases behave in order to bag points in the exam, ultimately. So Dalton, or John Dalton, Dalton's law states that the total pressure in a system is going to be the sum of the partial pressures of each individual gas inside that system. So if we imagine a box, and in that box the pressure is 100 kilopascals, and in that box we have 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen, we know that therefore there's a 21 to 79 split. That means oxygen is generating the equivalent of 21 kilopascals of pressure, and the nitrogen is delivering 79 kilopascals of pressure. Now, if you were to remove the oxygen from that system, the pressure in that system becomes 79 kilopascals. This works for ideal gases because the presumption is that these gas particles are so far apart in this lovely gaseous space that they are not interacting with each other. Unfortunately, in our awkward world of presumably and apparently metric, atmospheric pressure, 1 atmosphere, is the equivalent of 101.325 kilopascals when we're thinking about sea level, which is what 1 atmosphere is. There are conversions between all these various pressures that you're painfully going to have to know for the exam, so that you can, in the exam, decide to convert millimeters of mercury to centimeters of water, or an atmosphere to probably not millibars, that'd be pretty brutal, but like an atmosphere to a bar, to kilopascals, to pascals, etc., etc. Why do we care about Dalton's law of partial pressure? Well, we mentioned the saturated vapor pressure of isoflurane earlier, and this bears out if we've got that delightful system of oxygen and nitrogen, and then we put some isoflurane vapor in there as well. We squirt that vapor in, or in reality, we tip some vapor in the bottom of the bucket, and we will decide to presume that the volume of liquid we've added is irrelevant. It equalizes, it vaporizes, it reaches its saturated vapor pressure. Then you have squeaked in, because none of that oxygen or nitrogen has escaped, another 32 kilopascals of pressure into that system. So now the box, because that stuff's all vaporized, is operating at a higher pressure because it's muscled its way in. Yet another important pressury, physicky type thing to remember is this concept of standard temperature and pressure, which is sometimes quoted or sometimes examined. And this is atmospheric pressure, i.e. 101.325 kilopascals, but at 0 degrees C, which is the equivalent of 273.15 Kelvin. This is sometimes also used when you're being delightfully examined on these principles. Eventually, we're going to have to talk ideal gas laws. There is a Vivacast on that covered it, but we'll recover these things because you need to. I think I've read about the ideal gas laws like 50 times because it always falls out of your brain. And now that Charles is king, well, we're going to have to change the whole heckin' mnemonic for remembering it. Very unfortunate. I'm sure there's a slightly questionable one you could imagine with one of our non-members of the royal family, but unfortunately is a member of the royal family who's bringing the whole thing into disrepute. I'll have a think about that. So, wanted to be reasonably brief on Dalton's law. There are a number of links and references in the show notes that would explore that and explain that in further detail if you're interested, as well as another example of how the system might behave when you tip isoflurane into a bucket that is of a fixed volume, and actually considering the pressure alteration that isoflurane might cause. So what have we covered in this episode? We've compared isoflurane with sevoflurane and desflurane, and we now know that isoflurane is quite a potent drug. You don't need very much of it to achieve anesthesia. It gets out of the blood slower, technically, than sevoflurane and desflurane. But again, it's a nice stable drug that is very minimally metabolized. We've touched on Dalton's law of partial pressures, courtesy of John Dalton. John Dalton having been born in the year 1766 and considered a chemist, physicist, and meteorologist, a fellow with many feathers in his hat. And I've told you that you unfortunately need to learn how to convert different pressures, be that millimeters of mercury, centimeters of water, bar, kilopascals, and atmospheres. If you can do that, there will very likely be a question on that in the exam because it's just something that's quite examinable. So yeah, learn that. There's a list of it on the show notes as well. Fun times! Anyway, I hope you have a nice weekend. I hope you're super excited to learn more about sevoflurane. I've learned a few things about sevoflurane whilst preparing for that episode. For those who are also studying for the Primary FRCA 5er, keep at it, keep going. The end will soon be nigh. Try and practice with your friends as much as you can, even if you feel awkward.